The challenge is that people think big in terms of their goals, and then they start trying to act big. Oh, I'm going to go create this mastermind. I'm going to do this big marketing campaign. There's going to be Facebook ads and pixels and funnels and all this stuff. But it's about thinking big and acting small. What is that one simple action that you can do, not think you should do? Your wife tells you should do it. You can actually do it. You have the capacity to do it, such that by doing it over time makes everything else easier or unnecessary.
Hey guys, welcome to the Millennial Mastermind Podcast. Recording this intro at the end of a long day, so my voice is a bit shot, energy levels are a bit low, but we are pushing through. So is the life of a side hustler, as many of you guys know, and you can share in my joy and in my misery and in all of the motions in between of this crazy life we choose to live. But for today's episode, I wanted to reshare one, pull one out of the archives that is just very relevant to my life currently. And it's actually super relevant because of a book that I'm finally reading, or should I say listening to, because I'm listening to the audio. But that is The One Thing, the book by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. And this episode that I'm resharing today is one that I recorded way back in episode 42 with a guy named Geoff Woods. Some of you will be very familiar with Geoff's name. He actually was also the first guest ever of this podcast. He used to host a little podcast called The MMP, which blew up and became just a massively successful show before he was recruited to take over as vice president at The One Thing, which is the name of that book that I just mentioned, and also a company. And that all happened after he interviewed Jay Papasan on the podcast, asked him how he can help him out. Turned out that he could help him by helping him find somebody to step in as vice president of this company that they were creating. And he realized that that was the role for him. And so Geoff stepped up, took that on, and it's just a really awesome story of going from really a job that he knew was not the end-all, be-all, hence he launched the podcast, and within a year he had landed that role, which is just a super crazy story. So you can go back and listen to episode 1 to hear the full thing. But in this episode, we really dive deep into this concept of the one thing and what that means. And it's really a hard thing to really wrap your head around, that there's one thing that you should be focusing on. I know myself particularly, it feels like I'm being pulled in a million directions at any given time, and I'm trying to work on 1,000 things. But when you really boil this concept down and start to understand it, it makes a lot of sense, and it provides a ton of clarity. And there's some comforting, some comfort in the madness. And so I encourage you guys to really listen to what Geoff is saying about this concept, and then even go ahead and pick up a copy of that book or listen to it on the audio like I am. I think it's like a 5-hour listen, and for me that's like a 1 week worth of commuting, so it's pretty easy to work your way through, but it's really hitting home for me. So I wanted to pull this episode back out and reshare it for you guys, because I know that it was one that I needed to hear as well. So with that, here is my main man, Geoff Woods. First of all, thanks again for joining the show. I mentioned before we hit record that you are the first repeat guest. You were on episode number 1 when I stumbled my way. I just re-listened to that episode actually, and it was pretty hilarious trying to hear myself come up with questions to what you were saying, and my transitions were god-awful. So hopefully I'll do a little bit better this time around. But thanks again for sticking through that one, and then even being willing to come back again.
Of course. Glad to be here.
Last time we chatted, you had just moved to Austin. You were hooked up with Gary Keller and Jay Papasan to start working on this project, The One Thing. It was still kind of up in the air exactly what you were going to be doing. And we talked a lot about your past life at the Mentee podcast and mentorship and reaching out to people who are light years ahead of you. And it was an amazing episode. You just killed it delivering amazing content. But I'm really interested this time around to hear what you've learned now that, you're in the deep end with entrepreneurship. You're really every day interacting with these heavy hitters with Jay and Gary. And is there anything that you wish you would have known back when you were launching the Mentee podcast and just beginning to make that journey towards entrepreneurship that you've learned over the course of the past year?
The answer is yes and no. Of course, there are things that I know now that, man, if I knew that when I was starting the Mentee, wow. But at the same time, I am where I am today because of the knowledge that I had and the steps that I've taken. So I'm grateful for it, but even more grateful for the knowledge and, all the mentorship that I have received prior to moving to Austin was amazing, incredibly mind expanding. But the last year that I have been here working with Gary and Jay directly has been hands down the most mind expanding year of my life. And I'm excited to share some of those big rocks with all the listeners today.
Yeah, absolutely. So for anybody who hasn't read the One Thing book, and they're not familiar with the concept, would you mind just giving, the sales pitch of,
Sure.
or the elevator pitch of what exactly the One Thing is?
So Gary Keller started Keller Williams Realty, which is the largest real estate company in the world. When he started it, it was a small little local real estate company here in Austin. You fast forward to today, there's over 155,000 agents. And at the core of what led to that level of explosive growth is the one thing. It's the idea of how do you focus and prioritize all the things that you could do and narrow it down to the one thing that you can do, such that by doing it makes everything else easier or unnecessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful. And so my first thing that I know I think of when I hear that is, all right, that sounds great, but getting down to one item, like I look at my to-do list and it's crazy. I have my day job and then I have the podcast. Both are important to me at this point. I can't live without the day job, but the podcast is really something I want to focus on growing and getting more involved with. In such a busy world, when you do have a million things going on, and especially for somebody who might have multiple obligations, and beyond just a side hustle and a job, you got your family, different things. How do you really get it down to that one thing?
Well, this is one of the biggest misunderstandings. We all have more than one thing. We all have these different areas or buckets of our life, and there can be a one thing for every single one of those. And you just named two, Brad. You've got your day job and you've got the podcast. You have a one thing for your day job and you have a one thing for your podcast. This is about saying, which area of my life am I going to focus on right now? So if you had to pick one or the other that you really wanted to form a power habit around, which would it be?
For the purpose of this conversation and given your expertise, I'll say the podcast.
Okay, great. So what's the one thing and what's your goal with the podcast? Where are you struggling most?
So the biggest thing that I'm struggling with right now is to figure out how to monetize it. It's something that I'm having a great time with, learning a ton, really increasing the downloads and the listenership. That part hasn't really been too much of a problem. Month over month, that's growing. But where my struggle is the monetization factor and kind of how I approach that.
Awesome. So we're going to get to dive down this rabbit hole because I remember when I first launched my show about 3 months in, I really wanted to start monetizing. And I went through this exact same thing where I'm going, okay, what's the one thing I can do to monetize? What do you think that action is that you can do that will help you monetize faster than anything else?
The one area that keeps coming up over and over when I talk to listeners is forming a mastermind group to, connect some of the people who are listening to this. It's a concept that comes up over and over. And I mean, for God's sakes, it's in the title of the show. So that's probably the area that I would jump to first.
So we have one of two rabbit holes we can go down. We can talk about the one thing you can do to form your mastermind, or you already kind of told me what the one thing is. How did you get the idea for your mastermind?
It was an idea in my head, when I started the show, but I had no validation for it. And I let it kind of fall to the wayside, ignored it, and said, you know what, I would just be starting this because it's something that I think people would want. And I honestly forgot about it a little bit, but recently in the last month or two, I've had multiple guests multiple listeners who I've been talking to mention, I love the idea, but I don't know where to find one. I've been thinking, okay, well, let me go out and see if there's something that's applicable to what you're trying to do.
So what was the action that facilitated the validation?
It was just a conversation with a listener.
You got on the phone with your listeners.
Exactly.
That was mine too. I realized that if I wanted to monetize the podcast, I could try to start speaking, I could write a book, I could create a course, I could create a mastermind. Like there's all these things that you could do, but you're literally guessing. And I figured out that the one thing that I could do that would make everything else easier or unnecessary was to get on the phone with my listeners. And I gave away my scheduler link. I'd say, go to menteepodcast.com/call and you can book a time on my calendar. And I got on the phone with anyone and everyone with one goal: to figure out what their pain was and why the heck they were listening to me. And when I talked to enough people, they gave me the idea for my first product. They gave me the idea for my second product. They gave me the idea for a mastermind that I'm hosting here in Austin this weekend, which enough people said, please host a live event, that I finally said, okay, I'll consider doing it. On an episode I announced, I'm thinking about doing it. Apply here. And if enough of you apply, I'll take it seriously. You fast forward, it is a very, very, very lucrative event. And it was all done because I got on the phone with enough people that they validated it. So I'm going to ask you the question. If every single day your one thing for the podcast was to get on the phone with a single customer or a single listener, you talk to 5 listeners a week, would that make monetizing the podcast easier or unnecessary?
Yeah, absolutely. If I could sign, half those people, a quarter of those people up, absolutely.
Right. Go do that.
Perfect. It sounds so simple when you put it that way.
Well, when you look on the cover of the book of the one thing, it says the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. The challenge is that people think big in terms of their goals, and then they start trying to act big. Oh, I'm going to go create this mastermind. I'm going to do this big marketing campaign. There's going to be Facebook ads and pixels and funnels and all this stuff. But it's about thinking big and acting small. What is that one simple action that you can do, not think you should do? Your wife tells you should do it. You can actually do it. You have the capacity to do it, such that by doing it over time makes everything else easier or unnecessary. If your one thing every single week was to talk to 5 listeners, then there you go. Now the question is, can you legitimately talk to 5 listeners? Maybe it's 1 a week. Maybe it's 2 a week. Whatever it is, if you engage with your listeners, they're going to tell you what their pain is. They are going to validate the product, and you will be able to pre-sell the product before you spend a minute of your time creating that mastermind that eliminates your risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so I'll ask you one thing here, and this is getting pretty vulnerable here on the podcast and kind of opening up the window to my life and the operation side of it. But so I've offered that before. I've offered, let's connect, let's talk on the phone. And there's not an overwhelming response from listeners, which is surprising because I would be happy to connect many of the listeners with different people I know within my network now. But what did you come across that problem where you opened up that door of communication and
yes,
didn't quite have the response that you were expecting?
All the time. I will, I'll go on someone's podcast that I know will get downloaded by 30,000 people, and I'll give them my personal email address, and I know that I will receive less than 5 emails. Because every single person, if you give away your scheduler link, they might say, I'd love to connect with Brad, but what am I going to say to him? What's my reason for connecting him? I want to connect with him because I follow him. I trust him. He's helping improve my life. But what would I possibly say to him? What could I do to make him interested in me? How could I make it worth his time? Here's the secret, folks. I was in those exact same shoes when I needed to upgrade my 5. The difference is when I got on the phone with those people, I said, the area I need help is figuring out where I need help. I'm getting on the phone because first and foremost, I want to say thank you. I love your show. And I'm really lost. I'm not quite sure what that next step is. And I'm hoping we can have a conversation that hopefully will illuminate that next step for me. If you're not sure why you should be getting on the phone with Brad, then you should get on the phone with Brad to identify why you should be getting on the phone with Brad.
Yeah, I completely agree. I can't even explain how many times I've gone into a conversation with somebody who's either a mentor or just somebody who honestly is ahead of me in life, and coming out of that conversation, it went a completely different direction than I ever would have anticipated, because they know more than I know, and they have ideas that I don't have, and they lead me down that path.
It's tough to read the label when you're inside the box. It's tough to figure everything out that you can in your life when you're inside the box. It sometimes takes that person who's a little bit further ahead than you, who has more experiences, who has more perspective, who's able to illuminate the things that maybe don't appear to you.
So taking a step back, that rabbit hole you took me down to is phenomenal.
And you didn't expect that. You didn't expect that, by the way.
No, I didn't know that's where it was going to take me. I didn't know we were going to have that conversation today, honestly.
But you got on with me anyways today.
Exactly.
And now you have clarity on the one thing that you can do that will help you monetize the podcast,
which I am very grateful for.
There you go.
But so for somebody who is listening to this and they say, okay, that was a great little transaction they had, and now Brad has clarity on his next steps, but they're lacking that clarity themselves of what that one thing is that they need to do.
Yeah.
Maybe they're in a career that they don't love, and they know that they want to start something on the side, but they don't even know what that is yet. And they love the concept of, okay, I want to find the one thing that will move the needle, but they can't figure out where to get the clarity. Do you have any recommendations around that?
Absolutely. On page 114 of The One Thing, we have what we call the 7 circles. This is what Gary and Jay would argue are the 7 most important areas of your life. And I will list them off to you. Number 1, your spiritual life, because at some point you're going to wonder why the heck you're here. Number 2, your physical health, because if you don't have your body, where are you going to live? Number 3, your personal well-being, meaning the things you do that make you happy. Number 4, your key relationships, because we're relationship creatures. Number 5, your job. 6, your business. Or 7, your finances. Out of those 7 areas that I listed, what's the one that just struck with you where you're going, yeah, I've got pain in that area and I need improvement? The truth is, you have a one thing for every single one of those areas. It's about making a meaningful change in one first. Proving to yourself that you can make a change in one first. Just pick one and then ask the focusing question of the book. What's the one thing I can do for my personal life, my spiritual life, my job, my business, my finances? Such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary. And for Brad, he goes, monetize the podcast. Okay, well, what's the one thing I can do to monetize the podcast? Talk to my listeners. What's the one thing I can do to talk to my listeners? Put a call to action on every single podcast and every single email blast that goes out every week. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's Brad's one thing. There you go. The end. It's about applying the focusing question until you get down to something that is so small, so specific, so measurable that you can do it, and just start doing it consistently.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point that I don't want to overlook, is the consistency piece, because it's easy to start one of these things and maybe do it. I shouldn't say it's easy to start, but all too often one of these focuses is started, but then it a week later drops off the page and you're too busy, you're not seeing results, and next thing you know, it's out of sight, out of mind, and that's where you do not get results.
Now let's clarify a few things, because just because you've identified the one thing doesn't mean that that's all that you do. It's about doing the one thing first. Brad's got a lot of things he can do for the podcast. You know, he's got to record the interviews, whether he does the editing or not. He's got to do the social media promotion after the fact. He's got to line up more guests. There's a lot of things that Brad has to do to keep this going. But the one thing that he does first, before he earns the right to do anything else, is to make sure in that episode that he gives his that he gives his scheduler link, to make sure that in that that he writes that email blast and includes the scheduler link at the bottom, that he puts posts on social media saying, I want to get to know you. I want to customize content to you and possibly even interview some of you. Book a time here on my calendar so we can get to know each other. Before he does his interviews, before he does his editing, before anything else, he does that one thing. And I'll tell you a story about this. This turned my world upside down. It was very early on in my time working with Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. They were testing to see my vision. They were testing to see if I could think like a CEO before they promote me to be the CEO of the company. I was asked to bring my business plan to our meeting. I remember walking into the room. It's Gary, Jay, and me. And I've got my business plan on a piece of paper, just one sheet of paper, and it's got 3 points on it. Priority number 1, priority number 2, and priority number 3. Those are the 3 things that I need to do this year, that if I just do these 3 things, it will be a successful year. I remember we start talking about priority number 1. Gary asks a bunch of questions. I answer them, and I start moving on to number 2. About halfway through number 2, Gary starts asking more questions about number 1. I answer them, don't think anything of it, and I start talking about number 2 again. As I'm wrapping up number 2 and I get into number 3, Gary stops and starts asking more questions about number 1. I answer them. I say, are we good? He goes, yep. I start talking about number 3 for probably no more than 10 seconds until Gary stops me again and goes, quick question for you. Do you need to do number 3 to do number 2? I said, no. He said, do you need to accomplish number 2 in order to accomplish number 1? I said, no. He said, then do me a favor. Will you just put a line between number 1 and number 2? Or even better, rip the page in half. Crumple up number 2 and 3 and throw it in the trash, and don't think about them again until you have mastered number 1. That was game-changing for me. So often we look at all the things that we need to do in our life. The problem is we keep advancing each one just a little bit, kind of like a jack of all trades, but we become a master of none. When you get really hyper clear on that one area of your life that you need to make an improvement in, and you just say, I must do my one thing for this area first before I do anything else, that's when you start to see the extraordinary results.
Yeah, and quite honestly, for me, I know when I have a to-do list, or my areas of focus that are going to be those game changers, and it goes halfway down the page, I get stressed just looking at that, just seeing everything that needs to get done. But when I just knock one out at a time, it feels like I'm really making progress and really approaching that end goal, and just gives me that clarity and that really just the motivation to keep moving forward.
Exactly.
So one other thing that I'm curious about is, now that you've really implemented the one thing strategy into your life, you live it, you breathe it, it's your baby, has your daily routine changed at all? Are there things that you've added, removed to what you do every day to receive more clarity?
Night and day different. First and foremost, I refuse to put myself in a reactionary state from the moment that I wake up. Here's what I mean about that. I used to, when my alarm clock would go off, I would silence the alarm on my phone, and the first thing that I would do is I would immediately open my email, and I would check my email. And then I would check my social media, I'd check my text messages, I'd text Slack, and then I'd get out of bed. I wondered why, as I moved throughout the day, I felt scattered. And it's because, how many of you have ever been in this position where you check your email, you see an email from somebody, it looks curious, you open it, you spend less than 5 seconds screening it before you realize, I'm not going to deal with this right now. You close it, you mark it as read, but then as you move throughout the day, it's occupying your mind.
Yep.
The moment you start checking email, the moment you start looking at text messages, Slack, social media, you are putting your brain in a reactionary state. You are allowing the outside world to impose their agenda and their priorities onto you. When I look at my mentors, the people who get the greatest results in the world, they are in control of their time. So the first thing that I did is I refused to check email first thing in the morning. I don't do it until a certain time in the day. I don't check email when I'm standing in line in the grocery store and I get bored for a split of a second. I've actually removed the email icon from the home screen of my phone. I put it in a folder on the second page. So if I want to check it, I actually have to work for it. And now I've developed the processes that I actually don't check email at all. I have a virtual assistant who cleans it all up and sends me a Google Doc once a day with the important things that require my response. I give him a few bullets and he handles it, because it was wasting hours of my day every single day, and I know the value of my time.
Yeah, I can totally relate to that. I mean, just times, even when it's not in the morning, but I'm working on a project, I see an email comes in, I open it real quick. I'm like, oh, I'll just take care of that real quick. And I hop back to what I was doing, totally lost track of where I was. Takes a few minutes to get reoriented and back in the zone to writing whatever I was doing or working on whatever project that was. And the time wasted in between, sure, you knock that one thing out real quick, but you're losing all the time where you were just focused and then you lost focus. You have to regain a sense of where you were. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and another thing I'll share, and I think this will be more applicable back to what we were talking about earlier, which is we all have the different areas of our life that we can make progress in all of them. We need to improve in all of them. I think that's fair to say. The challenge that I struggled with for 4 to 5 years before working with Gary and Jay was I knew I could be doing better in my business. I knew I could be doing better in my marriage. I knew I could be doing better with my mental health. I knew I could be doing better with my physical health. And I tried to make meaningful changes in all 4 of those areas at the same time. And over that 4 to 5 year period, I ended up mastering none of them. It wasn't until I got to Austin when Jay looks at me and says, if you only could pick one, which would it be? And I said, I need to do all of them. And he goes, if you could only pick one though, which one would you choose? I'm like, well, I really need to do this one. And this. Yeah, but if you had to only pick one, just to start with, which would you pick first? And I said, well, since we're starting this company, it would be business because I need to get the business off the ground so I can stay in business with you guys. Okay, cool. What's the one thing you can do for your business such that by doing it, everything else will be easier or unnecessary? And I said, the first thing when I get into the office, before I do anything else, I knock out my one thing in a time block. He says, cool. And for 66 days, I tracked the days that before I checked email, before I said hi, before I went to the bathroom, before I got a cup of coffee, I would get on my computer and for 15 minutes, I would just do my most important work. Now, the reason it's 66 days is we know on average it takes a full 66 days to form a habit. And that's the inflection point where no longer it requires discipline or willpower for you to continue doing it. It's just like a car. You go on autopilot. And now I just do it. The moment that happened and I went into autopilot on my business habit, I then got to focus on developing a habit for my marriage. I tracked that for 66 days until that went into autopilot. Then I had 2 power habits that were working. I had stacked 2 habits. Then I got to focus on developing a habit around meditation. For 66 days, I'm applying my discipline and my willpower to meditating every single day until the point where, boom, autopilot. I meditate every day. And guess what? I still invest in my marriage every day. And guess what? I still do my business habit every day. And now I'm on the 4th one, which is around my diet. The mistake that we all make is that we try to do too many things at once. We try to chase too many rabbits, but when you chase 2 rabbits at the same time, you end up chasing none of them. Pick one. Prove to yourself that you can form a habit around one small thing. And the moment that thing hits auto drive, then you get to focus on the next one.
That's really interesting, especially being towards the beginning of the year. You know, myself included, it's so easy to list 6 different things that you want to start doing right off the bat. You know, a daily meditation habit, making sure that you're reading 30 pages a day, sending an email to my audience list once a week, and you have all these different things that once you pile them all on, you're trying to spend an extra 4 hours in your day to accomplish them all, and it's really tough.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I like your strategy of one at a time. And it also kind of ties into another point that often the millennial generation gets a bad rep for wanting to wanting to get things done right away, being the now generation. And I think to a certain degree, it's true, because we always have had the capability at our fingertips to get the information we need to do whatever we want in a very quick fashion. And then we see crazy success stories like your own, Geoff, where you start a podcast a year later, which seems like overnight to an innocent bystander. I'm sure that it was actually more than a year when you look at when you first started building your knowledge around entrepreneurship. But a year later, you're starting a company with Jay and Gary. So would you mind just talking for a minute about giving things the adequate amount of time to build the habits, to building the business and building that empire over time? Or if you see it a different way, where it is possible to do it in a very short amount of time, I'd like to get your perspective on that as well.
Well, let's clarify the question, because I'm not 100% sure what you're asking.
People who think that they can build an empire overnight, they haven't started yet, they haven't gotten clarity on what they're going to do. Do you think it's possible to make that happen at a very fast pace? Absolutely.
And here's case in point. When I first started the Mentee, I had no idea what I was doing. I had the idea when the night before an event, I'm sitting around a pool with a bunch of guys. They're looking at me saying, look at the guys who are your mentors. They're incredible. You should record those conversations and turn it into a podcast. And I said, what's a podcast? And they told me what a podcast was. And I said, okay, I'll do it. Because you know what? It sounded like a good idea. I figured I'd establish a platform, whatever the heck that meant. I had no idea. But in my gut, it felt like the right move. And I knew once I started doing those interviews and I launched the podcast, there was an opportunity to turn it into a business. I knew my one thing for that was to just every single day spend 15 minutes working on the podcast and the business behind it. If rain or shine, if I am sick as a dog, 15 minutes. Now, oftentimes I did well more than 15 minutes. I mean, I was investing 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours at night. I was really running hard to the point of burnout to get it up and running. But the marker of success was 15 minutes. You fast forward 1 year, which went by in a flash. It was a 6-figure business. If you had told me that in 1 year from the time I would start pressing record, January 13th, 2015, that by 2016, it would be in the top 20% of all business podcasts, and on top of that, be a 6-figure business, I would have told you you're nuts. But I wasn't focusing on the big. I was thinking big in terms of my vision, but I was acting small by holding myself accountable to just investing at least 15 minutes a day on the podcast and the business. And because
Why 15 minutes? Why such a small increment?
Because it was something I could do. And this was before, or actually I had read The One Thing at the time. What's the one thing you can do such that by doing it, everything else is easier or unnecessary? What's the one thing? Not 2 things, not 3 things, but one thing you can do. You actually can do it. No question, no ifs, ands, or buts. You can do it. That's why it was 15 minutes, because I couldn't reliably invest an hour a day. But I could do 15 minutes. If I am tired and it's time to go to bed and I hadn't gotten it done, I could go in the office and knock out 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. That's why.
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that, because it sounds like such a small amount of time that what can you do in 15 minutes? But you highlighted the point that oftentimes it ended up being much more than that.
And here's the important thing. Momentum. If you are one of those people out there, meditation is very trendy right now, and people say, I want to meditate for 20 minutes. Yeah, you and me both. But if you set 20 minutes as the goal, you do it on day 1, you feel like a champion. You do it on day 2, or you don't do it on day 2, you failed. You did 8 minutes. Day 3, you did 7 minutes. Day 4, you did 10 minutes. You feel like a failure. Versus, what if you set the bar at 1 minute? Can you do 1 minute every day? Every single one of us can. If you do 2 minutes, you're a rock star. The idea is to set the bar at a level where every single day you can do it so that you feel like a winner. and there's motivation and there's momentum to continue because you have to do it for on average 66 days before something happens in your brain where all of a sudden it is a habit and it no longer requires willpower or discipline. Just like you wake up and you breathe and you brush your teeth, you do your one thing. That's what it's about.
Perfect. So on another point with the one thing, when we first met, you were the host of the Mentee podcast. Now you're the host of the One Thing podcast, which I would love for you to talk about where people can find that. But what was the transition like to that podcast, and what was the decision there to change which avenue you were headed down?
This is a true testament to the power of surrounding yourself with the right people. When Gary and Jay said to me, "We want you to be the face of the One Thing." Wow, what an opportunity. I'm pinching myself. But how can I be the face of the one thing and have two things? That's not an integrity. I can't truly live the brand and not live the brand. So my natural reaction was to say, well, I guess I have to shut the Mentee down. Problem is, it's a damn good podcast, gets a lot of downloads, and it's a six-figure business. That's when Jay looked at me and said, no, man, why don't you apply what you've learned from us on building an empire and succeeding through others? Could you turn the Mentee into a platform where someone else could step in as the host for season 2 to document their journey and have everything they could possibly ever want inside your world? And at that moment, a light bulb went off in my head. And that's what I did. I announced that what was happening with me taking over the One Thing and starting that podcast and how it wasn't in integrity. But I said, the amazing part about this is this finally creates an opportunity for one of you to come out of the audience, to step in as the host for season 2, to have me as a mentor, for me to throw my Rolodex as you, and for you to document your journey. And at the end of season 2, you recruit the next mentee and they'll recruit the next mentee, kind of like a reality show. And we did a successful transition. Adam took over the podcast, and I'm still shocked today. The podcast is better. No joke, no ego. Adam is better than me as a host for that show. The downloads are higher than ever before, and I'm not even the one doing it.
Well, that's incredible that you could create an opportunity for somebody else like that within what you've already created and within your universe. So that's really awesome how that played out.
And the precedent had already been established for me. That's what Gary did with Keller Williams. And guess what? That's what the Romans did. That's how what Rome became Rome. If you actually study what happened there, at the heart of it is this idea that the reason talent leaves, the reason you ever leave a job is because one day you wake up and you realize you can't have everything you could possibly want inside the world of that company. So you leave. Gary started asking a different question. The Romans started asking a different question. How can I give myself permission to make my world so big, so abundant, that any talented individual can step inside my world, have everything they could possibly ever want, and be able to remain inside my world? And so when you start creating that type of structure in your life, that's when you're able to start recruiting top talent, like Gary and Jay recruited me, and I recruited Adam. And we are all able to remain in each other's worlds.
That's a great precedence to have set moving forward, because then that also lays the groundwork for creating a Roman Empire-esque organization out of the One Thing company that you're now working on.
Absolutely.
So, final question. If you could magically gift the Geoff Woods we'll go back to the day after you had this inspiration from your friends around the pool to start the Mentee podcast. If you could leave an anonymous package with one resource in it for him, whether that be a book, and we'll exclude the One Thing here, that would be too easy, but a book, a podcast, whatever you want it to be, is there one resource that you would leave for that Geoff Woods to stumble upon that would help him in his journey moving forward?
Oh, the answer would be a video from my future self. It wouldn't have been a single book, podcast, app, or anything like that. It would just be me understanding inside the mind of Gary like I do now. Because understanding that the true success comes when you succeed through others, and that my job every single day is to become the type of person that it is just a magnet for top talent, and that every single day I'm giving myself permission to make my world bigger so that someone else can step in and have everything that they could possibly want. If I knew that earlier on, I was already focusing on the right kind of relationships, but I would have been more intentional about developing very specific types of relationships because Gary, when he knew he wanted to step away from Keller Williams as CEO and just be chairman, the woman that he replaced himself with, he had been recruiting and in a relationship with for over 5 years. So for all of you listening today, it's not just about networking for personal gain now, but the relationships that you form today could serve you 5 years down the road when you might be in a position where you have to hire people or bring people to the table. And the people that I have developed relationships with over the past few years, I'm possibly forming business opportunities with some of these people that I would have never perceived that I could be providing opportunity for them because I perceived that they were light years ahead of me. But now the fact that I'm in a relationship with people at that level and I'm able to bring them to the table, oh boy, how does that look for me? So I would be more intentional about the relationships and playing a longer game.
Hey guys, thank you again for stopping by today to spend a little bit of time with me and the rest of the Millennial Mafia. Just a reminder, you can find all of today's show notes at millennialmm.com/podcast. And if you haven't heard yet, I'm opening up my calendar to you, the listeners, to hop on a 15-minute call with me. The sole purpose of this call is to connect and get to know each other. I want to forge true relationships with you so that we can build up an amazing network and community of ambitious millennials who are going to be the leaders and influencers of tomorrow. If you're interested, please just go to millennialmm.com/call and snag a 15-minute time slot. I look forward to connecting with you. Peace out.